Hello and welcome once again to the last video in the series on Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? In this session, I shall try to explain the fourth and the final part of the essay. In the fourth and final part of the essay, Spivak discusses the question of a woman and says that it gets problematic because of the differences in the first world and post-colonial contexts. In the post-colonial context, the three-way description of poor, black, and female loses its significance mainly because color becomes useless as an emancipatory signifier. So the problem is that of accommodating the third world woman. It is not just about reporting on or participating in the anti sexist work among women of color or women facing oppression in the first world and the third world. It is important to welcome all information retrieval in the silenced areas in anthropology, political science, history, and sociology. But even as we retrieve and construct a subaltern consciousness, this coheres with the imperialist subject construction, mingling epistemic violence with the advancement of learning and civilization. And the subaltern woman will remain as mute as ever. The problem of the muted subject of the subaltern cannot be solved by a search for the lost origins. It cannot be served by the call for more theory in Anglo America either. There is an often undetected complicity between essentialism and critiques of positivism. And Spivak admits that generally she remains sympathetic to aligning feminism with the critique of positivism, but she is not in favor of learning from the works of Western theorists. In seeking to learn to speak to the historically muted subject of the subaltern woman, the post colonial critic or the post colonial intellectual systematically unlearns female privilege. As a literary critic, Gayatri Spivak confronts the problem of the consciousness of the woman as a subaltern with great tact. To substantiate this, she attempts to reinvent the problem in a single sentence. White men are saving brown women from brown men. So, this is similar to the statement constructed by Sigmund Freud, that is, a child is being beaten. So, this sentence was constructed by Freud in order to bring to light certain issues regarding the deep seated nature of hidden emotions, fantasies, cruelty in the form of masochism, and also sadism. But Gayatri Spivak insists that it is not an isomorphic analogy. That is, an analogy between the statement constructed by Gayatri Spivak and the statement made by Sigmund Freud. Spivak just uses the sentence in order to disclose her politics, that whereas a Freud predicates a history of repression, a history with double origin, one that is hidden in the amnesia of the infant and the other lodged in the archaic past. Similarly, the history of repression that produced the statement or the sentence, white men are saving brown women from brown men, also has a double origin. And the history of repression has a double origin, and one of which is hidden in the maneuverings behind the British abolition of widow sacrifice, and the other one is lodged in the classical and also Vedic past of Hindu India, the Rig Veda and also the Dharmashastra. Spivak next proceeds to a discourse on the relationship between the imperialist subject and the subject of imperialism. And then there is this whole section of widow sacrifice. The self-immolation of the Hindu widow on the funeral pyre of the husband is called Sati. Now, this rite was neither practiced universally nor was caste or class fixed. Therefore, the abolition of sati has been understood as a case of white men saving brown women from brown men. And against this was the Indian nativist argument that women actually wanted to die. But one does not get to encounter the testimony of the women's voice consciousness. That is, it is impossible to put together a voice even from the police reports of the sacrificed widows, mainly because of the heterogeneity pertaining to aspects like class, community, caste, and so on. And singular events like the abolition of sati are invoked as requiring the breaking of the British word. That is, the British had supposedly had given word that they would not interfere with Indian customs or law. But practices like sati made it necessary for the British to intervene, mainly for the sake of instilling the spirit of a civil and good society as per the British standards. So, about the implications of the survival of a colonially established good society after decolonization, you can see that there had been the recurrence of this practice in independent India. But this was more of an attempt at the revival of something which cannot survive long, even in the backward areas of the country. The argument that the law was for the protection of women became a signifier for the establishment of a good society. Spivak mentions Foucault's historical narrative and his theoretical description of the episteme. The episteme is the apparatus or the knowledge to separate a ritual that is fixed by superstition and crime that is fixed by legal science. A private custom like sati assumed a public stature with the transition from the commercial relation of the British to a territorial and administrative presence. From the point of view of the native colonial subject, sati is a signifier with the reverse social charge. That is, it is a psychological marginality experienced when exposed to Western influence that exerts pressure upon the natives to demonstrate their ritual purity and allegiance to traditional high culture, resulting in the revival of past customs in order to prove conformance to older norms. The British wanted to create or establish an image of themselves as the establisher of the good society. And they just took up the cause of women as objects of protection. Gayatri Spivak selects two moments in the Dharmashastra for the discourse: sanctioned suicides and funeral rites. Though framed in these two discourses, the self immolation of widows or sati seems an exception to the rule. That is, the general scriptural doctrine is that suicide is wrong and blameworthy. But certain forms of suicides do not come within this tenet. There are two categories of sanctioned sacrifices. One is the first, rising out of a tattvajnana or knowledge of truth, and the second is the self-sacrifice of gods as sanctioned by natural ecology. There is no space for the self-immolating woman within this philosophical space. But an exception to this rule about suicides changes when it is performed in certain places. That is, the sanctioned self-immolation can happen only on the funeral pyre of the spouse. And the disgrace that is normally attached to suicides turns into a praiseworthy act and becomes an exceptional signifier of her own desire beyond the norms of widow's conduct. It was prevalent in the 18th and also the early 19th century Bengal due to reasons ranging from population control to communal misogyny. That is, in Bengal alone, widows could inherit property. That is, the British, they saw the poor victimized woman as an ideological battleground. And because in Bengal, women are entitled to the same rights as the deceased husband. So this was a way of getting rid of widows by appealing to their devotion and also love for the husband. Even the benevolent and enlightened males were actually impressed by the courage of the woman's free choice in customs like Sati and also Johar. So, what the British saw as heathen came to have greater magnitude as crime. The indigenous colonial elite, according to Spivak, occupies an ambiguous position. That is, as is revealed in the nationalistic romanticization of the strength, the purity, and love of these self sacrificing women. Spivak mentions Tagore's poem about the self renouncing paternal grandmothers of Bengal, and also Ananda Kumaraswamy's eulogy of Sati as the last proof of the perfect unity of the body and the soul. Though Gayatri Spivak does not support this custom, she says that the ritual was redefined not as a superstition but as a crime. So, this is actually strange in a country where the Mughals encouraged heinous and barbarous punishments like impaling and flaying alive. Even European countries had such ferocious penal codes and orgies of witch burning and religious persecution. Therefore, it is strange again that despite the prevalence of all these horrible acts, the English conscience was shocked by the act of Sati. So their justification was that the victims in the other case were supposedly offenders who were punished by law. And here, Sati victims were punished for no offense. During the British codification of Hindu law, the British consulted the Brahmin scholars about Sati. But later they decided against the collaboration because, according to them, or they thought that it would give the false impression that they condoned the practice. And when it could have been read along with martyrdom, it was categorized along with murder, infanticide, and lethal exposure of the very old. The free will part of the constituted sexed subject as female was successfully effaced, and no itinerary could be traced there. Spivak invites the readers to compare widow sacrifice with the notion of Gandhian Satyagraha as a form of resistance. Though the doctrinal appropriateness of sati was debated, the general law of celibacy or brahmacharya was hardly debated because there was no debate on the fate of widows. The possibility of recovering a sexually subaltern subject is lost. And the heavenly rewards for Sati includes blissful life with her husband as long as 14 Indras rule. Spivak also discusses the irony in locating the woman's free will in self immolation. This draws its ideological strength by identifying individual agency with the supra individual. Killing yourself on the husband's funeral pyre is killing the female body in the entire cycle of birth. Similarly, another 20th century male historian writes like this: the Johar is practiced by war widows to save themselves from unspeakable atrocities from Muslims. This became an act of female heroism. And particularly in the patriotic stories told to children, thus operating on the crudest levels of ideological reproduction. Spivak mentions Raghunandana, the 15th or 16th century legalist, whose interpretations of the Rig Veda are supposed to lend the greatest authority to such enforcements. But then there seems to have been a slip in his interpretation, where the word agre was read as Agni. The same passage from Rig Veda discusses brahmacharya, which is celibacy, and niyoga, that is brother-in-law marrying the widow. So even the word sati is the feminine form of sat, which is a word that transcends the gender specific notions of masculinity to move upwards to spiritual universality. It could thus simply mean a virtuous wife. That is, the word sati could have the simple meaning of a virtuous wife. Hence, this could have been an error or a misinterpretation on the part of the British, and the statement, white men saving brown women from brown men. The British, they were trying to impose upon the women a greater ideological construction by identifying good wifehood with self-immolation. So they are all part of manipulations. Gayatri Spivak calls Edward Thompson's book Sati, which was published in 1928, the perfect specimen of the justification of imperialism as a civilizing mission. Even the names of the Satis he mentions in the book are English, like Moonbeam, Deerheart, etc., which are probably English translations of Indian names. Elaborating further, Spivak says that the name Sati is a common or a very popular name in India today, and it has been derived most probably from the Sati of Hindu mythology. The story of Sati is another instance of women's ideological self debasement. So, this is all part of the imperialist move to erase the image of the luminous fighting Mother Durga and invest the proper noun Sati with no significance other than the ritualistic burning of the helpless widow as a sacrificial offering who can then be saved. So there is no space from which the sexual subaltern subject can speak. And now she proceeds, Gayatri Spivak proceeds to give an example to illuminate a section of the social text. And she makes use of the example of the case of Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, who hanged herself at her father's apartment in 1926. She was part of some militant group fighting for independence. She killed herself only because she could not perform her mission of political assassination. The discussion on the suicide of Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri has been included in order to establish that subalterns cannot speak. Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri was a young unmarried girl at the time of her death, and it is also mentioned that she chose to commit a suicide while she was menstruating in order to rule out narratives of illicit pregnancy. Yet, this attempt that the girl made to speak got effaced, denying her both agency and voice. The real reasons for the suicide could not be revealed as she was a member of a militant organization. But she did not want anybody to think that the motivation for suicide was an illicit love affair or pregnancy. But her family remained in the dark about the real cause of her death until years later. In fact, the suicide even came to be thought of as caused by some illicit love affair. Now, Spivak uses this example of the death of Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri in order to prove the point that the subaltern female cannot be heard or read. So it is just not enough to provide them condition, to provide the subaltern conditions to speak, as the post-colonial intellectuals say. They need to be represented. And the essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, concludes with a reiteration of the responsibility of the post colonial intellectual when Spivak says, the female intellectual, as intellectual, has a circumscribed task which she must not disown with a flourish. So, with that, we come to the end of the video series on Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Hope you find them helpful. Thank you.